Correct.
Alto Bud Adams Jr.
That's right.
And what we're trying to do is we want this to be part of our family history archive at the Regional History Center. And first thing I'd like to ask you, I'd like to get some of the family tree. And I know your father was Alto Adams Sr.
Yes.
And I read that he was born in Walton County.
That's right.
Right? What town was that?
It wasn't a town. It was at Glendale, which is a little community north of Defuniak Springs. Defuniak Springs is the county seat. It is not too far from the Alabama line. My grandfather was an orphan boy of the Civil War, and he was illiterate, but he valued education so much he became chairman of the school board of Walton County.
And was he an Alto?
No,
What was
it was Lenya Adams.
What?
Lenya Adams was his name.
Lenya. How do you spell that?
Lenyer.
Just like it sounds. And your father married, who did your father marry?
My father married Carol Williams.
Was she from Walton?
Originally she was. They grew up close together, but as the farming community around Walton County began to get more built up, her father left the farm and went to what is now the Ocklawahnee River swamp, where he hunted, fished, raised cattle, and caught bears.
And he was able to send his son to the University of Florida.
Yes, my father, as he finished high school, like all of his other brothers, he was given 40 acres of land, and he started to get the stumps out of it and decided that wasn't what he wanted to do. And he agreed to give the land back to his father if he would send him to the University of Florida. And my father was the first graduate of the University of Florida to serve on the Florida Supreme Court. And
now, I read on Wikipedia, if you believe it, that your father practiced law for a short while in Pensacola.
that's right. In Pensacola, merchants there would take in gopher tortoises in payment for their dry goods and things. And they would keep them in their store and sell the gopher tortoises to the sailing ships that came in there. Because there was no refrigeration, that was the only fresh meat they had, they would store the gophers on the ship. So gophers were a means of paying for stuff.
Means of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
That's something, I never heard that. That's something new. And then, see, from what I read, he came to Fort Pierce in 1924. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay. And began to practice law.
That's right. That was the boom era, and so there was lots of business for a lawyer, closing deals and arranging loans and things like that. So he made money, and he speculated some in real estate, and he lost it like everybody else did when the boom busted. When I was a young boy, the first home I remember was in Maravilla on the golf course.
Really?
And then when I was, I guess, 6 or 7 years old, we moved to the house on the hill on North 7th Street overlooking the harbor.
I guess that's what I'm thinking.
Yes.
About. Yeah, does that have still
No, it's been taken down.
What about the one in Maryville? Is it still standing?
I think it is. Yeah, I saw it a few years ago, and at that time it was facing the golf course. Of course, that golf course was pretty famous at that time, but it's not in use anymore. It's all built up.
Yeah. So when did your father start this ranch?
My father hunted, as a lot of people in Fort Pierce did, and at that time in the 1930s, why, none of this land was fenced. It was open range. You could drive in dry times. You could drive a pickup truck all over it, and so my father saw the land out there, and it wasn't in use, and it wasn't paying taxes. It wasn't fenced, and so he thought it might someday have value. And as we were coming out of the Depression in 1937, the Murphy Act came in, which allowed people, if they would start paying taxes on their properties, they would forgive the back taxes. And so my father saw it was an opportunity to own land, and this land was owned by a man in Iowa, and he flew in an early airplane out to Iowa to, my father wanted to buy a small tract of land, plant a grove on. And the man said, well, I have all this great acreage, I'll sell you the whole thing. My father said, I don't have the money to do that. And he said, you look like an honest man. I will sell it to you on credit. You pay me when you can. So my father bought a very large tract of land. He sold off part of it to Mr. Belcher, who was one of the few wealthy people in Miami, and he kept the present land. His purchase marked the end of the open range. The open range in the West occurred in the 1880s as settlers began to move in among the cattlemen. But in Florida, this had persisted up until the 1930s, and many of the cattlemen would own a relatively small piece of land and maybe graze 1 million acres for free. And but my father had the foresight to realize that if you were going to use the land, you would have to buy it, you'd have to fence it and pay taxes on it. And so he bought this and fenced it. And at that time, I was about 11 years old, and I wasn't big enough to load posts on a wagon, but I drove a mule and a wagon, and the men loaded the posts in the cypress swamp. I hauled them out and kicked them off, and so I was involved in the ranch from the very beginning.
You must have been strong.
No, I wasn't. In those days, we had malaria, and I was sickly, and but I liked being outside.
Yeah, but that must have been really hard work, getting those trees, logs, and getting them off the wagon. I bet it was beautiful out here.
Well, it is. It's a beautiful country.
But I mean, back then, you didn't have, did you have pastures like you have now? You just had woods, didn't you?
Initially, we just built a fence around the perimeter of the ranch, and my dad bought Wright Carlton's herd of cattle, and with it he got the Cross 7 brand, which we still use. And I went with the cowboys to gather the Carlton cattle. They were down in Little Cane Slough and down as far as Alapata and ranged up north of Vero. And so we gathered the cattle and put them inside the fence, and that was the start of Adams Ranch.
When did you learn to ride a horse?
Oh, I've had a horse ever since I was about 10 years old.
So did you work as a cowboy?
Yes, I went with the cowboys, and I worked with them. And in those days, we'd get out of school in June, and we would work here. And by August, I would be sick with malaria, and I'd spend August in Riverside Hospital in Jacksonville. And but that's a thing of the past now.
So I'm sorry about that. So once you have malaria, you always have it, so you still have it, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me about, like, when you were a cowboy as a young man, did you have your own dog?
No, we didn't use dogs much. Screwworms were brought into Florida in the mid-1930s in drought disaster cattle from the Southwest. And screwworms found a perfect home in Florida. And if you had a dog that would bite the cattle, it would allow the screwworm infection. So cowboying has changed a whole lot. Before the screwworm, while they used dogs and cow whips and no lariats. And then as we began to, as we got screwworms, while we used dogs very sparingly, and we doctored a lot of calves, and we used lariats to rope the calves and doctor the screwworms. So cowboying changed each phase of the business.
Well, how did you treat the screwworms?
Well, screwworms would get into any cut or opening in the skin, and most screwworms got in the navel cord of newborn calves. When the calf was about 10 days old, he would have a big infection of screwworms. We had a combination of benzene and other materials that you could pour in there would kill the worms, and we'd put pine tar on it to keep from being reinfested.
So it wasn't dipping, that was something else when the cows had to be dipped.
Yes, the dipping was entirely different things. They were trying to eradicate the fever tick. And by 1937, the cattle in this area were free of the fever tick, so we did not dip our cattle like they did further inland in the Everglades. In those days, hunters hunted this area relentlessly. There was practically no deer, no turkeys or things like that, and hunters would come out and throw out a match and burn, and doves and other things would flock to that burn, and they'd come with pickup trucks and hunt. And but in those days, the deer had been depleted, and because the deer were gone, the panthers were not here.
What about, was your father, was Alto Sr. an environmentalist? Or was that before his time?
We didn't know the term in those days. The fact that he took care of the land and fenced the land, once we fenced the land, that stopped illegal hunting. So it was a good environmental practice because as the ranches were fenced, gradually after our ranch was fenced, the McCartys, the Peacocks, and the Carltons and others, they realized that if they were going to continue to use the land, they would have to buy it, pay taxes on it, and fence it. So I'd say 1937 was about the end of the open range, and of course, as the ranches were fenced and posted, why the game had an opportunity to come back, and it was a good environmental thing, although we didn't think of environment in those days.
I shouldn't have asked the question that way because I knew that environmentalist is a new word. But so after it was fenced, that's when the deer. Because I know you have lots of deer now, right? You have lots of deer now.
Oh yes, yes, the deer and the wild turkeys, all the wading birds and whooping sandhill cranes, all those have come back.
What about cats? Do you have any bobcats?
Yeah, we've always had bobcats and foxes and coons and the smaller animals.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember a man called Moody Whidden?
Moody Whidden?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I farmed with Moody.
Well, he and my father used to be buddies.
Yeah.
And they would go hunting, although my father wasn't a big hunter. But I remember Moody bringing a dead cat to our house. We grew up on Jenkins Road.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just remember him being a real hunter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you farmed with him?
Yes. We were good friends with Leslie Scott. And Moody was with Leslie, and so I went on a lot of trips with Moody and Leslie.
Now, when so you were in Maryville and then up on the ridge, and then at what point did your father build a home out here?
Well, my father was appointed to the Supreme Court. This was about 1939, so he had barely stocked the ranch with cattle before he moved to Tallahassee. In 1939, there was no one to take care of the cattle, so he sold the cattle, all the cattle, to Earlo Bronson for $22.50 a head. And Earlo was a very large, well-to-do cattleman in Kissimmee, and he came down to count the cattle. And I was out of school, and my father appointed me to represent them at the cattle count, and I wasn't very big and I wasn't very good at counting cattle, but they'd run the cattle through the gate, and Earlo would say, "How many did you get?" I said, "About 70. He said, "No, there were at least 85. So Earlo was a very generous a man to work with, and we liked him very much. So Earlo fattened the cows, slaughtered all the cows, sold the meat, and this was World War II was beginning then. And Earlo said, the ranch is vacant, the grass is good, we really ought to put some cattle on it. So my dad and Earlo bought a herd of cattle from Teat Homes, and we drove them from over near Loretta across and put them here in the pasture. Cattle were moved in those days by cattle drives. Before then, we'd sold our steers to Lykes Brothers. We would drive them to the Kissimmee River. There was no bridge at Bassinger, and we'd swim the river at Bassinger and sell the steers to lakes. So cross-state cattle drives continued until after World War II, because trucks were scarce and everything, and but my father and Erlo, they ran a very successful cattle business during the war, and the profits from that were used to start what's called Bass Motor Company. It was the first Cadillac and Pontiac dealership in Fort Pierce. It was run by their friend Tolly Bass, and they ran that as a business until Tolly's death, and then it was sold to Reed Houghton.
Well, who was, when your father was in Tallahassee and he and his partner were raising cattle on this ranch, who was in charge of this ranch?
Arlo would bring his crew down here about 3 times a year, and in the summertime I would come with them, and we'd mostly gather up the cows, sell the calves, and that's all we did. But it was a profitable business because during the war you could get about $40 a piece for the calves. We essentially had no costs, and so it was mostly profit.
Were there any buildings on this ranch?
Yes, this barn you see out front, it was built in 1937, and that's kind of served as a headquarters for the ranch ever since. There was a couple of other houses here. My dad's half-brother, Andrew Adams, stayed here part of the time, and he took care of the place. And there was an older house down where my present home is. I got married in 1949, and my wife and I built our present home, which we still live in. The old house had burned down, so but the new house is not new, but it's been there since 1949. But
what was your wife's name is Dot, right?
Yes.
Your wife's name is Dot?
Yes.
What was her maiden name?
She was a Snively. Her family were big citrus growers in Winter Haven, and they were a well-known family in Central Florida.
And how did you meet her?
I was at the University of Florida after the war, and there were 10,000 boys there and 40 girls, and they were pretty badly spoiled, so girls were imported from FSU, and they would come on a weekend, and she came to a fraternity party. I was an ATO, and I met her there, but I didn't know her very well. But later I had a chance to, she was a citrus queen, and in the Fuller Warren parade, inauguration parade, why, she was on a float with the Citrus Commission, and I was on the side of the road. She threw me an orange, and so I knew she was an AD Pi, so I called her, and that started our relationship.
Isn't that a wonderful story?
She was the best looking girl at FSU, no doubt.
And I've heard just as nice.
Mm-hmm. She's just as nice as she is beautiful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So, when did you first move out here? Do you want some water?
No, I'm fine. to go back to 1944. I lived in Tallahassee with my parents, and I graduated from Leon High School in June of 1944. Of course, that was right in the middle of World War II. In July of '44, I was in the U.S. Navy, and so I served out to the end of the war in the U.S. Navy. I didn't do much, but I was involved. And then I graduated from University of Florida in February of 1948. And the day after I took my last exam, I got in a car and came to the ranch. I told them to mail my diploma. And so I started on the ranch in February 1948. And the cattle on the ranch were owned 50% with Earlo Bronson and 50% with my father. And Earlo said now that I was here, he would sell out his interest, and I was given a half interest in a little over 1,000 cows. They were worth about $40,000. And my half interest was probably worth somewhere around $20,000. I was given that to be a working partner of Alto, Adams and Son. My father continued to live in Tallahassee. So at age 21, I had complete charge of Adams Ranch, and I was also the head cowboy, head laborer, and ditch digger and everything else. But that relationship continued quite profitably for a number of years. And later on, it was replaced by Adams Ranch Incorporated. As we began to have children and all, why we realized that instead of dividing the land up into small ranchettes, we could divide the stock ownership among the children and keep the ranch as a working unit. So I think that was a big step forward in incorporating the ranch, and it was family owned. So it has continued to this day.
What was your father like? His personality?
My father was easy. My mother was tough, and she was the disciplinarian, and if we did something wrong, my father would talk to us about it, but my mother would do more. And so my mother was a disciplinarian. She was very education conscious, and she made me study, and because of that, all through growing up here in Fort Pierce Elementary, I don't think I ever made anything less than an A, and I credit my mother for that. My father was more permissive, and he was very adamant that you should obey the law, and he was a strict interpreter of the Constitution, and that's what he believed in, and we were made it very clear that we should not break a law. And I told him I had gotten some speeding tickets, and he said, if you don't speed, you won't get a ticket. And of course, he was right.
So your mother was the tough one. What did she do? Whack you with a whip? I mean, a stick?
Yeah, yeah. Switches.
Yeah, switch. That's what I was trying to say, switch. Yeah. You went to the Yellow Brick School?
Yes, I started right there at Delaware School at the, I guess, the southeast corner. And then I left. I was in the 9th grade and was studying algebra under Mrs. Miller and all those famous teachers.
So you went to high school in Tallahassee?
Yes, I was in the 9th grade when I went to Tallahassee, and it was a little tougher. They didn't realize that I was always a straight A student, and I had to work a little harder.
Did you like Tallahassee?
Actually, I didn't. I didn't have my friends there. I had never been so hot in my life. I'd never seen the temperature really hotter than body temperature. But our house in Tallahassee was on Calhoun Street. It was a big masonry house. It was so hot you could not go in there until we'd sit in the yard until about 9 o'clock at night to go to bed. And the winters were too cold. And Tallahassee is the most beautiful place in the world in April. But after then, well, it's different.
I read somewhere that your father was good about representing black people when he was an attorney here.
My father, his interpretation of the law, I've had girls graduating from law school say, I'm not going to represent these criminals. But my father said, the basis of the law is everyone is entitled to representation. And he didn't care whether you were black or the Ashley gang or anything else. His office was open and he would represent it. And of course, some of that was very unpopular with the Ku Klux and different ones. Why we actually had guards on our house at times. And but that was a different era.
When you said, like, when you were in Tallahassee, you list your friends, who were your friends here when you know, like, when you were in grade school?
Well, the Andy Tucker family, their sons were John and Ann Tucker, and Claudia Sneed of the Sneed family, and the Harold Holtzberg was in my class. There were a couple of Jewish families, the Reubens and the Holtzbergs. Both of them had served as mayor and were the most respected families in the town. And I was a good friend of Arthur Reuben and Harold Holtzberg. Earl Lish, whose brother was the first man killed in World War II on the Arizona. And that's what the Eugene V. Lish unit here is named for. And we were friends with Donald Moore and H.B. and Sonny Kobelgard was a year or two older than I, so we weren't big friends until after World War II. And after that, we hunted and fished together. And my sister was a good friend of Sissy Kobelgard, and they would go to the movie every afternoon. And my sister would go in with Sissy, and Sissy would say, I'm a Kobelgard. That meant she didn't have to have a ticket. And so, it was a rather small group of people in Fort Pierce in those days, relatively, and you knew everybody.
What What did you like about being a cowboy?
Oh, just to get on a horse and I could go anywhere I wanted to. And there was just something about it that in the summertime, when I was in high school in Tallahassee, Earl Bronson would let me come and live with them in Kissimmee. And Earlo had cattle from Orlando down through Kissimmee and St. Cloud down to the Lake Kissimmee. His ranch was almost 100 miles up and down the Kissimmee River. And I would live with the Bronson family on the weekend, and on Monday morning we'd go out with the cowboys. He'd have about a 10-man crew, all real good cowboys. And first day out, why, he'd let the cowboys kill a heifer calf, and we'd hang it under a tree, and that was our food for the week. No refrigeration, but beef was safe to keep. Beef and venison was safe. Pork was not. It had to be refrigerated. But it was a wonderful experience of working with some of the best cowboys in the world. And that was long in 41 or 2, I guess. And as the war started, while all the cowboys went to the Army. And by 1944, why, Earlo crew was a bunch of old men and children. Pete Clemens and I were 15, 16 years old, and we got the work done just the same as the good cowboys had done. And but it was a wonderful experience to every week you saw new land that you'd never seen before, and new cattle. And
what did you learn from those guys about character?
Well, first you'd go there and you'd hear nobody talking to anybody. They'd all out there be handling the cattle, and I'd ask one of the men, say, what do you do? Does anybody tell you what to do? He said, no, you watch the men, and where you see they need help, you go help them. And I never heard Earlo give an order to any employee. The most he'd say, I said, I believe I'll work around this way if you want to go the other way. That's about as big an order as he ever gave. And but everybody knew that he was the boss. If he suggested something, why, you were to do it. And
it seems to me, maybe this is just myth, because I've read a lot of cowboy stories. My dad used to love cowboy books. But it seems to me they would probably be men of honor.
These Earlo Bronson later became a state senator and representative, and had one of the best reputations of any man I've ever heard of. Earlo Bronson Highway, everything is named for Earlo Bronson up around that area. But there were all kinds of people, but cattle business was done pretty much by, I'll sell you these cows at $22 and a half. There were no written contracts, and the cattle were delivered over a year's time. Prices had changed, but if they went down or they went up, there was no argument about it. And because your reputation was within this group of cattlemen, and if you'd ever told a lie, people would know it. And if you told the truth, people would know it. So it was kind of a self-policing thing that it made cattle business easy to do business with. You could do it on a handshake and be pretty well satisfied with it.
What about the cowboys in that crew that you worked with in those summers? Were they honorable men?
They were top-notch. Henry Lee Reeves and Tommy Reeves, they were sons of a fence builder in Kissimmee, and they were working for cowboy wages. But Henry Lee was such a fine man that when my dad bought a plantation in Georgia, he got Henry Lee to go up and manage it for him. Henry Lee moved to Quitman, Georgia. Pretty quick, Henry Lee was elected to the Georgia legislature. He survived as the longest serving member in the history of the Georgia legislature. And his brother Tommy was a good man. There were several Bronsons that were probably far off relations to Earlo, like Shane Bronson was one of the best cowboys I ever saw, and one of the hardest working. And he is the father of Charlie Bronson, our past Commissioner of Agriculture. So all of those people in Kissimmee were very high type, mostly I'd say English background people. There was one black family in there, the Silas family. They had their own cattle, their own ranch, and Lawrence Silas was, he was on the board of directors of the local bank, and he was respected the same as anybody else. And I bought a Cadillac a number of years later from a black man working as it was, I think, Tyrone Silas, and he was related to the Silas family. But they had their own land, their own cattle, and they were well respected.
Now, you have a reputation of being a really good photographer. When did you get interested in that?
When I was about 10 years old, my mother would take me down to Laurel Hill Studio, and we'd see the pictures that he'd made and things like that. And I was given a 35 millimeter Argus camera, and I would bring it to the ranch and I'd photograph the coons and the cattle and the cowboys and everything. So I've been taking photographs with a 35 millimeter camera since I was 10 years old.
And you have several books published, right?
Yes.
I haven't seen those, so I'd like to see those before we leave. But now I know that there's a history about when you made this or developed this new kind of cattle. Did I say cow? Cattle.
Yeah.
That's a cross between
Bremen and Hereford.
Okay. Can you tell me about that?
Our cattle on Adams Ranch started with the Spanish cattle that my father bought from Wright Carleton. They were descendants of the cattle that were brought here 400 years ago. Those cattle had adapted to Florida. The ones that couldn't stand the bugs and the ticks and things, they died off. So they were very hardy cattle, and there were some good things about them, but they were tough and scrawny and didn't make very much beef. And so the first step was to put some Brahma blood in those cattle. It made the cattle grow bigger, and of course they were very heat tolerant and everything. And by the time I came here at age 21, I realized that I'd been in Tallahassee. I'd seen up there they had Hereford and Angus cattle, quite good cattle, and I realized that these Brahma cattle just weren't quite good enough to be what we wanted. So I thought if we could cross a Hereford bull with a Brahma cow, where the Brahma was weak, they were small boned, thin fleshed, and bad temper. The Hereford was big boned, big muscled, and good temperament. So I chose the Hereford to cross with the Brahma, and the calves were just outstanding. We now know that due to heterosis and hybrid vigor, when you cross unrelated strains, it's just like hybrid seed corn or anything else, you get a big step up in production. And so we really liked the calves, but the bulls died. And the bulls were brought in from out west, and they weren't immune to our mosquito-borne diseases like anaplasmosis and things like that. We didn't even know what it was in those days. But those bulls came down and mosquitoes bit them and they died. And so I studied economics in University of Florida. I never took an agricultural course, but I went to the geneticist at the University of Florida, Dr. Koger, and I told him that we can't bring these Hereford bulls down here and have them die. I was going to use these crossbred bulls. And Koger said, well, we don't really recommend that you use a crossbred bull because they're unpredictable. And but I see that you're going to use them anyhow, and because you need to. And if you can get them through the first 2 or 3 generations, they will then begin to breed true to type in a more predictable manner. And he gave me a book on genetics, and he said, now, if you get through the chapter and you don't completely understand it, read it again, and you'll know just as much as anybody that graduates here. And so I did, and I got quite interested in cattle breeding, and the Brayford cattle were just a tremendous improvement. And before we had them, I was grass fattening Brahma steers here and selling to Florida packing houses for slaughter steers. They were commercial grade steer. And they weren't too good, but they were a means of making a living, and they were meat. And so feedlot people would not buy Brahmas. And when we got the Brayford steers that were half Hereford, why the feedlot people would buy those. And a lot of those went to Washington Courthouse, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. I'd load those steers on the freight car in Fort Pierce, right in downtown Fort Pierce, and send them to the Corn Belt. And so you can see how times have changed. But the Brayford were very successful, and after 4 generations, why the U.S. Department of Agriculture recognized them as a new breed. And that's one of only 4 or 5 new breeds that's ever been built in the world in the last 100 years. So I think that was probably the greatest thing that I've ever done was the Brayford cattle. We continued on with the Brayford until 1990. And I began to see the price of steaks at these Ruth Chris steakhouses and things like that, and said, why can't we raise that quality beef? And we knew that came from highly marbling of Angus and other breeds. So I had seen the research at Clay Center, Nebraska. That's the USDA Meat Animals Research Center. And they would do this hybridizing thing, like chickens and hogs are all hybrids and everything. Cattle have never taken to that. They like their Angus, their Herefords, or their Brahmas, whatever. And they did not take to hybridizing. And but in 1990, we set up what we call the A Beef Program, the Adams Ranch Beef Program. We crossed Brayford cattle with purebred Red Angus and other Brayford cattle with purebred Geltby, which is a large German breed, a tremendous amount of red meat on them and everything. And so I had these two hybrids, and then I mated the Red Angus hybrid with the Geltby hybrid, which was a double hybrid, and they began to get even better and better. And so since 1990, we have been into this program of what the A-beef is. And it's gradually developing into a breed of its own. It will never be a closed breed, because to keep the heterosis and hybrid vigor in them, we will keep introducing some Red Angus and some Geltby and Brayford blood into that to maintain the heterosis. But it's been a very exciting period of cattle breeding. And Adams Ranch, I think, is right up there with any place in the world so far as that type of breeding.
That must make you very proud.
What's that?
That must make you very proud.
Well, I'm very proud of my cattle, as I am my family.
Yeah. Did you find any signs of when the Indians were here?
Yes. When we moved out here, there were Indians living here. And there was an Indian woman over here that lived in a hammock. She was said to be 100 years old, over 100 years old. And my father all the other Indians had left her there, and she was, I don't know how she lived, but my father would take her food once or twice a week, and we did not know then, we called her Aunt Polly, but this was Polly Parker. And Polly Parker was pretty famous from the Indian Wars of the mid-1800s. See, she was born in 1820s to 1830s, and she lived to the 1930s. And the story was that she had a lot to do with leading federal troops astray in the Indian Wars. And she first was captured and put on a ship at Tampa to go to Oklahoma. She jumped ship at Cedar Key and walked back down here. That's why she was still here. Other Indian families living in this area are called the Cow Creek Indians, so are Sam Jones and Willie Tiger, and some of those I employed as cowhands.
Were they good cowboys?
Not especially. They would work when they wanted to work, and when they didn't want to work, they wouldn't show up. And that was their nature. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad. It just wasn't what we were used to. Dot and I had 3 sons, and all 3 have worked in the business. Lee is the oldest, Mike is here in the room, and Robbie is the youngest. They have 8 grandsons and 4 granddaughters. Some of them are musicians or artists in other places, but 3 of the grandsons work here on the ranch with the cattle, and Leanne works here as she's kind of our help with governmental affairs and the environmental thing. What we're trying to do now is we see that Florida is rapidly becoming an urbanized area, and our open spaces are being lost. And it is our wish that some of this land be preserved in perpetuity as cattle ranches and its present condition, as a place for wildlife and cowboys and horses and that sort of thing. So we have undertaken an environmental program, and my granddaughter Leanne is kind of heading that up. The Nature Conservancy and the Florida Audubon Society have been working with Leanne to do some what they call agricultural easements. The Florida Forever program has funded millions of dollars to buy Florida land. When they buy a ranch, they displace the people there, the people lose their jobs, the land no longer produces food, it does not pay taxes to the local school districts. With the easements, while the people keep the land, but they can never develop it into housing or urban areas. And so if we've accomplished our first easement already, but it's my wish that I could come back here 50 years from now and still see cowboys working cattle on this land. And there would be nothing like it in the United States to be able to do that. It's a very difficult thing to do. A few years ago, we were approached by a man said he would pay a large sum of money for our development rights, and we keep the land. I told him that'd be okay, and we're willing to do that. And the fly in the ointment was there's an old abandoned citrus grove over here that had to be approved for a new type of development, and the people developing that grove into things would pay for the easement. It would cost the county nothing or anything, but the county wouldn't go along with it. So we temporarily given up hope in St. Lucie County, but Leanne has secured an easement on the ranch in Osceola County, and she's now working with the Secretary of Interior to get that done. And I think we'll get it done.
Well, I'm sorry, but we're out of time. But I want to say, I have learned so much in this hour.